This is how easy it is to use AI when you're doing your interview studies in just a matter of 4 steps. Before we begin, we need to understand what actually are we studying. So that's the first step. You have to decide on your research topic, your area, your questions. And in order to get the questions for your interview, you can, of course, start out by noting them down on a piece of paper. But even better, if you want to use AI, you can actually get suggestions on questions that you can include in your interview guide. And we're going to do this right now. So we're going to go to avinote.com, which is an AI tool for academics, for researchers, but also students in academia and outside of academia as well, for people who do research in companies, for example. In order to start out with Avinote, you click on register. Once you've registered for a free account, you can try it out. So now I'm inside of Avinote. I'm going to go to the AI snippets here on the left side, which we also call AI templates. You're going to click on data in order to get to the questions part, and then we're going to click on suggest interview questions. Now, in this example, I'm going to choose a study that I just made up. So I want to study the, say, sensitivities of the general public with regards to nuclear power, if they fear it, and so forth. So now, obviously, if you're going to do a study, you would be much more detailed. You wouldn't use imprecise language like this, and your research questions would be much more narrow. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to keep it very general, and we're going to click Generate Text. So essentially what the AI will do is going to try to produce an interview guide that is semi-structured. So you're going to have main questions, you're going to have introductory questions, and then you're going to have possible follow-up questions depending on what they say. We don't want to have any leading questions, of course, so we're going to avoid those, and we only ask the possible follow-up questions if the person says yes or no, and then we follow up with whatever follow-up question that we have. So in this example, we see that the AI came up with a few suggestions. The first suggestion is, could you please state your full name and occupation, which is, of course, a very common question to ask. Could you describe your background and any relevant experience or expertise you have regarding nuclear power? So that's like the second question that the AI came up with. Now, this is actually a very useful question to put in the introduction because you can create different cohorts. So you can create, for example, a cohort of people who have had experience with nuclear power, maybe lived near a nuclear power plant, or had, extended family that used to work there or something like that. And then people who have not had that. And maybe you would have differing views, differing opinions based on which cohort they belong to. So it's really useful to ask those types of introductory questions in order to get different cohorts that you can then study. Then you get your main question. So the AI comes up with ideas, and obviously you have to decide if these questions are useful or not. If they're bad, you remove the question, so you can just remove it if you don't like it. Of course, you can ask your own question. So my own question here. So you don't have to follow blindly, but of course, always think. You're the grown-up in the room. The AI comes up with suggestions, and then you work with that material. So here the AI says, do you have any specific concerns or fears regarding nuclear power? If yes, could you please elaborate? How do you perceive the safety of nuclear power plants? Are there any specific safety aspects that worry you? Are you aware of any incidents or accidents related to nuclear power that have influenced your perception of its safety? If yes, could you please describe them? So the AI is asking questions that relate to essentially our what we told it to, basically explore the sensitivities that people have among the general public when it comes to nuclear power. And then if you like the questions, you can alter them, you can change them. So if you want to add something on, you can do that as well. And once you've gone through your main questions, you need to design your final questions. Even before then, we have the possible follow-up questions. So for example, here it says, you mentioned, and then it refers to a specific response. Could you please provide more details or examples, which is always useful? Could you elaborate on your fears slash concerns mentioned earlier and explain why they are significant to you? Now, you would only ask this specific question if the person actually had fears or concerns. If they don't have any fears or concerns, then obviously you don't want to lead them into that type of answer. So it's important to sort of avoid those types of questions. And then finally, we have the final questions. So is there anything else you would like to add or discuss regarding nuclear power and public perception? I'm smiling because this is the type of question you would always ask, regardless of what type of study you're doing. Another question you would usually ask is to ask people if they want to participate in any future studies, maybe follow-up studies. And then finally, the third question that you almost always ask is, can you recommend somebody else or other organizations or people that we could talk to that you feel would be relevant? So it's sort of like the snowball methodology of getting interviews. where you go to one person and then you ask them, once the interview has concluded, do you know anybody else we could talk to? And then it goes on from there, right? Okay, so we have our questions. Let's say we're happy with these questions. We can save them here. So I'm just going to say interview guide, and I'm going to save it under workbook that I've called data. You can name your workbooks whatever you want inside of AvidNote. You just go to saved documents, and then you can create any workbooks that you want. So I've saved this as the interview guide. Now, if I want to continue working inside of Word, I can actually save this to my computer. And then I'm going to get the Word file, because a lot of the times you don't want to work inside of like a web app. You may want to work inside of your computer and continue working later on. Or if you're offline at some point, maybe you need it for like when you're not connected to the internet. So you have your questions here. You can, of course, play around with them, change them. And once you're happy with that, you go and you interview the person. Now, of course, interviewing the person, there's some guidelines there as well that I'm sure you're familiar with. Number one, you would need their consent. That's very important. Depending on which jurisdiction you're living in, you may need that in written form. And if you're going to get it in written form, make sure that you include that it is being recorded. And if you plan to use it to transcribe, for example, with AI, which we intend to do, you can put that in the consent form as well. So it's very important to always follow ethical guidelines when it comes to interviewing people. And then another tip that is very, very important when you are recording, it's not so important to use an actual, say, bona fide microphone for the recording purposes. These days, you can just use your iPhone or your Android phone. They record well enough. However, what I would recommend is to place it near the both of you and to have a additional recording device, because you can't trust that device is going to work. It might stop working, the battery might drain or something. So always have two recording devices. Easiest, from my experience, is to have a phone, and then on top of that also have your laptop and record from both devices, just in case something happens. You'll have a backup. So now you have basically formulated your questions, you have conducted the interview. In my example here in our study, I don't have a person to interview, so I'm going to use an interview from the past. And because it relates to nuclear power, we're going to use an interview with none other than Robert Oppenheimer, the famous physicist from the United States, who was, of course, leading the Manhattan Project back half a century ago. And so really sort of a monumental figure when it comes to nuclear power and everything that deals with nuclear topic. So we're going to look at this interview, and what we're going to do is we want to transcribe it. Let's pretend that we've already made the interview, we have the recording, and now we want to upload that recording. So we go to AvidNote again, we click on AI Transcribe, and inside of here, we can then either drag and drop our audio file or video file, or we can click on the browse button. I'm just going to drag it over here. And then you see it's been dragged over. You can then select which language was spoken. English is by default, but you can select a number of different languages that we support. You can, of course, also enable speaker labels. This is a new feature. It works only for certain languages at the moment. We intend to roll out more languages in the future, as well as timestamps. And so with timestamps, it will give you the time when everything was said, so you can easily sort of switch between the different sections. And then we're going to click transcribe. Now, the final option here, I've left blank. If you want, you can enable this as well. So this is the personally identifiable information redaction, which means essentially that if you want to redact anytime the interviewee mentioned the personal name of somebody and cross that over, the system will do that automatically if you have this enabled. So that's like an additional level of security for very, very sensitive data. Now, just a careful sort of note there, it can't tell the difference between names that you should redact and names that you shouldn't redact. So if you have this enabled, it's going to redact all names just to be on the safe side. But if you have it off, or if you have it on, it doesn't really matter in terms of safety, because everything that is stored inside of this app, inside of AvidNote, is always private by default. And we use industry standard security measures. So it's only shown to you and anybody else that you give your consent to share with. So if you're sharing it with a colleague or something like that, then of course that would be shared, but it's not shared with anybody else. And it's never used to train the AI as well. And all of the data stays within private GDPR certified servers here in the EU. And that's also to be compliant with various data regulations, both in Europe, Australia, and the US. So what you get here is you get the different speakers. So it says speaker A, speaker B, and then you can listen back to it if you want to by just clicking, and then it's going to play. Now, Of course, it's not playing right now because I'm using my recording device here, but if you listen to it, you'll hear it from your computer by clicking on the play button. You can also click on the time stamp, and then it will jump to that corresponding time. So you can see that the audio recording is skipping between these different places. So when you click on any section, it's going to jump to that specific time. Now, I would always recommend that you should read through the recording, the transcript, to make sure that it's correct. Most of the time, it's really good. As you can see here, for example, it says, well, it's for many people. There are no telephones ringing, and you don't have to go to committee meetings, and you don't have to meet classes. He's talking about working in this research institute and not teaching. It's interesting that researchers still complain about having too much classwork, or they used to do that even 60 years ago or 70 years ago, or whenever this was recorded. So essentially, what is going on here is you get the entire interview transcript, but sometimes it will commit mistakes. So for example, you can see it misspelled the name of Oppenheimer. So we can fix that. So I would always recommend listen through one time at least and make sure that it's all accurate. Because we're saving already so much time, we shouldn't be lazy and skip through and just use the transcript. It's useful to just listen through one time, make sure that it's correct, and then use it. In the past, we had to do this by hand. It would take hours. Now you would just take a few minutes to do, essentially. So once we have the transcript, what you can do is, if you want to name the people, you can do that. I would recommend actually just opening up a new Word file. So if you actually want to name the people, just open up a blank Word file and paste in your text. And then if you want to name the people, you can do so by just clicking Control-G and then click on this place where you find and replace, and make sure that you replace this with the names. So let's pretend that this is me as an example asking the questions, and the person who is answering, speaker B, we want to put in Oppenheimer. We're going to be respectful. We're going to put in Dr. Oppenheimer, and we're going to say replace all. So now we get the people speaking, as you can see, labeled. So this is very, very useful, of course, to keep track of what people said and so forth. But for privacy use cases, we always keep it just speaker A and B, because sometimes you don't want to mention any names, right, in your transcript. And so we're going to copy this now, and let's go back to AvidNote. If you want, you can save this file. I would recommend that you do that. Oppenheimer and nuclear power is what we're going to call this file. And we're going to click Save. Of course, this will be saved inside of AvidNote. It will be saved here under your saved transcripts. You'll be able to find all of your research data here, alongside, of course, your papers and written work, which we won't cover in this video, but you can do that as well in AvidNote. It's sort of a all-inclusive application for people in academia using AI. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, because we've just completed our next step, and we're ready to go on to the next step. Rather, we completed another step. So the next step now is, of course, to analyze this. And to analyze it, there's different ways of doing it. So if you're old school, what you do is you go to the data column, and then you use some framework to code your interview. So you can code it either by defining how you want that coding to occur, or you use grounded theory, which is, I would say, probably the most common way to code interviews. So in this case, you get like the open coding of the different terms that was used, and then you get the axial coding where those are connected within the themes, and you get the selective coding at the end that is gives you more specificity. So if you just want the terms and work out the analysis yourself, you would start out with coding the material, and then you would save that. However, if you're ready to do the analysis immediately, what I would recommend is to choose a framework to do that. So you can either analyze it with a framework that you define here under Analyze Data with Framework, or you use the narrative analysis, which is my favorite. So you just paste it in, you click Generate Text, and then in a matter of seconds, you get the narratives and everything that was sort of said in the interview broken down into various narratives, followed by an analysis that the AI did, followed by relevant quotes that are relevant for that specific narrative that we're looking at. So it's extremely useful in giving you that first draft, that first go at the analysis. And then, of course, that doesn't mean that it's finished. It's now up to you to sift through this and to find the gold coins among all of it, right? So if you go up here, we'll see the first narrative. They talk about this institute where Oppenheimer used to work. They then talk about the faculty at the institute, the people who worked there. For example, Piaget, who I believe was famous for looking at how children learn. And he used to work at that institute. They had Einstein actually visiting the institute. This is a long time ago, of course. They had Niels Bohr. So they're talking about all the people who visited this institute at that time. And then they talked about, visiting scholars who would visit there sometimes. And then here he talks about the supply of scientists. He basically views that place, the institute, as Operation Bootstrap, he calls it. One great teacher, one great man of learning changes a country. He says that I think that statistics and tables maybe don't tell the whole story, which is true for academia even today. There's a lot more to be said than just numbers. Then he critiques government secrecy. This is very relevant. Of course, he was part of the Manhattan Project, which he sort of lamented at the later part of his life. But what you see here is Oppenheimer essentially talks about government secrecy, and he emphasizes the importance of open communication in a complex technical world, argues that secrecy denies the government the wisdom and resources of the entire community, which is, of course, a quote from Oppenheimer. So what you see here is the quote that connects to this specific narrative. So Oppenheimer said that the trouble with secrecy is that it denies to the government itself the wisdom and the resources of the whole community, of the whole country. And so you get essentially these different quotes that you can then interweave into your own study when you're doing your analysis part of your paper. You can use what is useful here, of course, elaborate, make sure that it's accurate in terms of what the transcript says. And then, of course, when you're doing and writing it in your own voice, of course, and make sure that it fits the overall narrative that you're portraying. And then finally, for most journals, if you're using AI in some capacity, they would say that you would state that in the research methodology section, which makes sense. I mean, before AI, you would probably say, I used NVivo or something to code this interview. And so in this case, you would just say, I used AvidNote and then the version number in terms of the year. So you'd just put 2024, for example, AvidNote 2024 to analyze this interview or to code this interview or whatever. So that's really all. That's how easy it is to work with this. Of course, it's the stepping stone. It doesn't do everything for you, but it does a lot of things for you. And then it's up to you to then continue on, do amazing research, and keep on publishing.